winter came early that year, and it came hard. It arrived not with ceremony, but with a silence that crept in overnight. The wind died first, then the birds vanished. By morning, the land lay locked beneath a pale crust of frost that did not melt when the sun rose. In the backcountry, men knew what that meant. This was not a passing cold. This was the kind of winter that tested whether a settlement would still exist by spring. On the frontier, cold was not an inconvenience. It was a force, patient, relentless, and lethal. It split green timber. It froze breath into crystals inside beards. It turned damp wool into armor made of ice. And once it settled in, it did not leave until it had taken something with it. The cabins scattered along the river valley looked sturdy enough from a distance. Squared logs, notched corners, stone chimneys rising like sentinels against the gray sky. They were built the way men had built for generations, methods carried across the Atlantic from forests that never knew this kind of cold. In Europe, winters were harsh but predictable. Here they were something else entirely. Inside those cabins, families woke to frost feathering across the walls. Their breath hung thick in the air even before dawn. Children slept huddled together under blankets stiff with cold, while mothers fed fires that never seemed satisfied. Wood disappeared faster than anyone expected. A day's cutting barely bought a night's warmth. Fireplaces roared, flames clawing upward, pulling heat straight out through chimneys like open mouths to the sky. Sparks cracked and snapped. Smoke crept back into rooms when the wind shifted. Men cursed and added more logs, more wood, always more wood, and still the cold pressed in. Among them was a man who worked quietly at the edge of the settlement. He was not the strongest nor the loudest. He had no grand stories of war or conquest. But he had learned something the others had not, because he had watched instead of laughed. Months earlier, while trading along a nearby trail, he had seen how indigenous families gathered around fire. Not towering hearths, no stone chimneys reaching for the sky. Their heat stayed low, close to the ground, held in place by earth and stone. Fires that burned slower, smaller, and lasted. It stayed with him. When he returned, he did not speak of it. He simply began digging. At first, the neighbors assumed he was building a root cellar or setting posts. But when the pit deepened and stones were set low into the earth, the jokes began. Planning to sleep in a hole? One man laughed. Another spat into the snow and shook his head. That's not a fire. That's how natives squat. The word was said with a smirk, primitive, backward, something to be endured, not learned from. They believed heat had to be conquered, forced into submission with height and flame and endless fuel. Anything lower was weakness. Anything borrowed from the people of the land was ignorance. The man said nothing. He kept working. He lined the pit carefully, fitting stones not for beauty but for mass. He packed earth tight around them. He shaped airflow with intention, not instinct. When he finished, the fire pit sat low and unimpressive, barely rising above the packed dirt floor of his cabin. It looked wrong to anyone raised on hearths and chimneys. Laughter followed him wherever he went. It echoed off frozen trees and lingered in the thin winter air. "You'll freeze by Christmas," someone called after him. He nodded once and carried on. By late autumn, the sky hardened into steel. Snow came in waves, first light, then heavy, then unrelenting. The river slowed and began to choke with ice. Game retreated deep into timber. Woodpiles shrank. Men rose before dawn to split frozen logs that rang like iron when struck. Axes bounced, fingers numbed. Every strike carried urgency. Every load of firewood was a wager against the night ahead. Inside the cabins, fires burned bright and hungry. They devoured days of labor in hours. The chimneys pulled warmth upward, leaving cold to settle low around feet and beds. Mothers woke children throughout the night to shift them closer to the flames. Outside, the man with the pit finished sealing his floor. The wind rose again. It pushed through gaps in the logs. It found every weakness. Snow drifted against cabin walls and climbed, until doors opened into white silence. One evening, as men gathered to talk of weather and wood, someone asked him outright why he hadn't built a proper fireplace. He shrugged. "Didn't need one." The laughter came harder this time. Louder, nervous even. By then everyone could feel it. This winter was different. The cold had weight to it. It pressed down on roofs and shoulders alike. Animals froze where they stood. Trees split open in the night with sounds like rifle shots. Forecasts were not written, but they were felt. The elders knew. This was a long winter, the kind that emptied cabins and filled graves. Neighbors reinforced chimneys. They stacked wood higher. Some burned furniture, some burned fences, anything to feed the fire. The man lit his pit once each evening. The flame was modest, quiet. It did not roar, it did not leap. It settled into the stone and earth, spreading warmth outward instead of upward. The ground drank it in. The walls followed. From outside, his cabin looked no different. Smoke rose thin and steady, no sparks, no drama. Inside, the floor stayed warm beneath bare feet. No one noticed at first. They were too busy fighting their own fires, chasing heat that fled faster than they could replace it. Pride kept them from looking sideways. Fear kept them working. The cold deepened. And as the settlement braced itself for the worst winter any of them had known, one man sat quietly in a cabin that did not creak as much as the others. Its warmth held low, patient, and waiting. The laughter faded with the light, and the real test had yet to begin. Long before the first log cabin rose from these valleys, before iron stoves and brick chimneys cut their silhouettes against winter skies, people had already solved the problem of cold. They had no steel, no glass, no mortar hauled from distant kilns. What they had was time, generations of it, and a land that punished mistakes without mercy. Those who survived learned quickly. Those who didn't were buried beneath snow and forgotten by spring. Across the northern forests, the plains, the mountains, and the high deserts, indigenous nations learned that fire was not something to show off. It was something to control. They understood what settlers did not. Heat is heavy. It sinks. It clings to the ground before it ever rises. Let it escape upward and you lose it. Trap it low and it stays where bodies live. In winter camps, fires were built shallow and deliberate, not roaring bonfires but steady cores of warmth. Stone rings were chosen not for appearance but for mass. Earth was not an obstacle, it was insulation. Frozen ground, when packed and layered properly, slowed heat loss better than any raised hearth ever could. The settlers never saw this as engineering. They saw it as primitive habit, but there was nothing accidental about it. Indigenous fire pits were positioned with the wind in mind, openings shaped to draw air without pulling heat away. Smoke was allowed to drift, not surge. Flames were fed just enough to stay alive, not enough to waste fuel. Heat soaked into stone, into packed soil, into sleeping platforms built close to the ground where warmth lingered longest. It was physics learned the hard way. European settlers arrived carrying assumptions forged in very different climates. In the forests of Germany, France, and the British Isles, fire meant height. Hearths were tall. Chimneys drew smoke cleanly upward. The goal was light, not efficiency. Fuel was plentiful. Winters were sharp but brief. Here, those same designs bled warmth into the sky. Settlers believed a visible fire was a powerful fire. Flames that leapt high meant safety. Chimneys that roared meant success. Smoke rising fast was seen as cleanliness, not waste. They did not understand that every breath of smoke pulled warmth with it. The man who built the low fire pit did not understand the science in words either. He had no formulas, no diagrams. What he had was memory. He remembered watching indigenous families in winter, how they gathered not around flames, but around warmth that seemed to rise from the ground itself. He remembered nights when snow lay deep and still, yet no one shivered. Fires burned smaller than he expected. Wood piles shrank slower. At first he assumed it was luck, then he noticed patterns. The fires were always low, always surrounded by stone, always sheltered from wind. He noticed how people slept closer to the ground, how bedding was layered atop earth that held the day's heat long after the sun disappeared. He noticed what they did not do. They did not chase fire. They did not feed it endlessly, they let it work. When he asked questions, answers came carefully, not as instruction but as observation. Fire goes where you let it, one man told him. If you let it leave, it will. Back among the settlers, no one wanted to hear this. They spoke of superiority, of progress, of civilization. They believed tools improved by becoming louder, brighter, bigger. A roaring hearth was proof of mastery. A quiet fire was suspect. What they didn't see was how quickly their mastery was burning away. Wood disappeared faster than planned. Axe heads dulled from frozen grain. Men traveled farther each day for fuel. The forest receded, leaving exposed ground that invited the wind closer. The low fire pit challenged everything they believed about warmth. It looked weak. It offered no spectacle, it did not announce itself, and yet it worked. The principle was simple: thermal mass. Stone absorbs heat slowly, but releases it slowly too. Earth, when packed and layered, holds warmth far longer than open air. Heat radiates outward before it rises, if you give it something to cling to. European fireplaces ignored this. They emphasized draft. They fed airflow aggressively, pulling heat up and away. They were efficient at removing smoke, and just as efficient at removing warmth. Indigenous designs did the opposite. They restricted airflow. They slowed combustion. They treated fire not as an enemy to be contained, but as a partner to be guided. The man began experimenting quietly. He tested stone placement. He adjusted airflow with small channels. He noticed how long warmth lingered after flames died down. He paid attention to the floor, not the ceiling. Others paid attention only to him. They mocked his dirt-stained hands. They joked about his Indian hole. They warned him he would choke on smoke or freeze before the new year. He listened, nodded, and kept working. As winter tightened its grip, the difference between philosophies grew sharper. Settlers fought the cold like an invading army. They burned harder, louder, faster. They measured success in how bright their cabins glowed against the dark. Indigenous systems did not fight the cold. They endured it. They slowed it. They shaped their lives around its inevitability. One burned fuel to dominate nature. The other conserved fuel to survive it. By midwinter, the consequences were impossible to ignore. Wood piles dwindled. Fires burned down to embers before midnight. Smoke hung thick inside cabins as drafts failed in shifting winds. People slept in layers, waking stiff and exhausted, their bodies spending more energy staying warm than healing or resting. The man with the low fire pit slept through the night. He was not warmer because his fire was stronger. He was warmer because it was smarter. As temperatures fell further, the settlement stood divided, not by walls or fences, but by understanding. One side clung to tradition, the other unknowingly to the future. And winter had not yet delivered its worst blow. The cold does not care how proud you are. It does not care what you believe. It only asks whether you learned fast enough. Soon it would demand an answer. The storm announced itself long before the first snow fell. It came as a pressure in the air, a tightening silence that settled over the valley like a held breath. Dogs whined and refused to leave doorways. The forest stopped moving. Even the river seemed to hesitate, its dark water thickening beneath a skin of ice. By dusk, the wind arrived. It swept down from the high country in hard, screaming gusts that found every crack and seemed the settlers had missed. Snow followed soon after, dry, sharp flakes driven sideways, rattling against cabin walls like thrown sand. Within an hour, the world beyond the door vanished. Inside the settlement, fires were lit early. Flames leapt high in hearths as families prepared for a long night. Wood was stacked close, axes leaned against walls, boots set near the door for the inevitable trips outside. No one slept easily when storms came like this. By full dark, the wind was howling hard enough to drown out voices. Chimneys roared as drafts intensified, pulling flames upward faster than planned. Sparks raced skyward, disappearing into the blackness. Inside, heat came in bursts, brief and uneven, while cold pooled along the floors, creeping toward beds and cradles. The fires burned faster than they should have. Men rose from benches and stools to feed them again, and again. Logs cracked as moisture flashed to steam. Embers glowed bright, then dimmed too quickly. Smoke rolled back into rooms as wind shifted, stinging eyes and throats. Mothers wrapped scarves around children's faces to keep them breathing clean air. Outside, the storm tightened its grip. Wood piles shrank visibly. What had seemed ample days ago now looked dangerously thin. Each log burned felt like a mistake made too late to undo. Before midnight, the first man pulled on his coat and stepped into the storm. The cold hit like a blow. Snow reached his knees in places, deeper where drifts formed against cabin walls. The wind ripped heat from exposed skin in seconds. Fingers numbed almost instantly. He reached the woodpile by memory more than sight, shouldered what he could carry, and stumbled back inside with ice forming in his beard. He would do it again before dawn. Across the settlement, the pattern repeated. Fires demanded constant attention. Sleep came in short, anxious fragments between stoking and checking on children. The cold did not rush. It advanced slowly, methodically, seeping into joints, into lungs, into resolve. Inside one cabin, a woman pressed her palm to the wall and felt ice beneath the wood. In another, a man cracked open a chair for fuel without a word. Pride was gone now. Only survival remained. Smoke thickened as chimneys struggled against the wind. Some fires burned dirty, starving for oxygen. Others flared too hot, wasting what little fuel remained. The settlers fought the cold with everything they had, and still it pressed closer. Then there was the other cabin. At the edge of the settlement, barely visible through blowing snow, the man with the low fire pit knelt once and struck his flame. It caught quietly. No roar. No sparks, just a steady glow settling into stone and packed earth. He fed it carefully, then closed it off. The fire did not need watching. It did not demand tribute every hour. It simply worked. As the night deepened, his cabin changed in ways subtle but profound. The floor warmed first. Heat spread outward in slow, even waves, soaking into the walls, lingering where bodies rested. The air stayed clear. Smoke drifted gently, controlled, unconcerned with the chaos outside. He slept. While others woke to cold fingers and dying embers, he turned once beneath his blanket and breathed steadily. Warmth did not flee when flames dimmed. It stayed. It held. Outside, the storm punished anyone foolish or desperate enough to step into it. One man slipped on ice buried beneath snow and did not rise for several minutes. Another lost feeling in his toes and did not notice until pain exploded hours later. Frostbite took what it wanted, silently and without warning. By the middle of the night, some cabins went dark. Their fires had burned through the last of their wood. Families huddled together, wrapped in every scrap of cloth they owned. Mothers held children close, counting breaths, listening to the wind claw at the walls. Men sat awake, staring at hearths gone cold, knowing the worst hours were still ahead. Cold is not dramatic when it kills. It is patient. It lulls. It convinces the exhausted to rest just a moment longer. In the quiet hours before dawn, the settlement lay divided by warmth. Most cabins were silent now, heat gone, hope thinning. The storm raged on, indifferent. Snow pressed against doors, sealing people inside with whatever warmth they had left. From one cabin, a thin ribbon of smoke still rose, steady, unhurried. Someone noticed. A man stepped outside to check on a neighbor and paused, confused. He felt warmth near the ground as he passed that cabin, a subtle difference he could not immediately explain. He pressed his gloved hand to the doorframe and felt something he had not felt all night. Heat, others followed, drawn by instinct more than reason. They stood in the storm, staring at the cabin they had laughed at. No roaring chimney, no frantic smoke, just quiet endurance. Inside, the man slept on. As the wind began to ease and the sky lightened from black to steel gray, the truth became unavoidable. Something was very wrong, and something was very different. Dawn would reveal the cost. Morning came slowly, as if the sun itself hesitated to look upon what the night had done. The storm passed in ragged silence, leaving the settlement buried beneath drifts that swallowed fence lines and blurred the paths between cabins. Smoke no longer rose in confident columns. Most chimneys stood cold, their mouths rimmed with ice and ash. Doors creaked open one by one. Men stepped out stiffly, movements slow and uneven. Faces were pale, eyes rimmed red from smoke and sleeplessness. Fingers were swollen and mottled, some already turning the dull gray that promised lasting damage. A few limped. Others carried children who had cried through the night and finally gone quiet. Inside the cabins, the truth was worse. Hearths lay choked with cold ash. Walls were blackened where smoke had rolled back again and again, leaving scars that would not wash away. Woodpiles were gone, reduced to splinters, broken furniture, fence rails torn apart in desperation. Winter was not finished, not even close, and then someone noticed the smoke. It rose thin and steady from one cabin near the edge of the settlement, drifting upward without urgency. No sparks, no roar, just warmth, alive and breathing. A man stood in the snow, staring. The door opened and the settler they had laughed at stepped outside. His movements were unhurried. His breath did not cloud the air the way theirs did. He looked rested. For a long moment, no one spoke. The laughter that once followed him had vanished, replaced by a silence heavier than the snow itself. One by one, they moved closer. Inside his cabin, the difference was immediate. The air was warm, not stifling, not smoky, just warm. The floor beneath their boots held heat. The walls radiated it gently, as if remembering the fire long after flames had settled. Men knelt without thinking, pressing bare palms to stone and earth. Mothers brought children closer, eyes wide. No one joked, no one scoffed. They asked questions instead. How long had it burned? How much wood had it used? Why wasn't there smoke? The man answered simply. He showed them the pit. Low, plain. Stones dark with absorbed heat, packed earth firm and warm beneath the hand. It stays, he said. That's all. For some, the realization came quickly and painfully. They saw their own cabins in their minds, towering fireplaces sucking warmth skyward, chimneys acting as open wounds in the heart of the house. They saw weeks of winter still ahead and wood that would not last. Others resisted. They stood back, arms crossed, faces tight. Pride does not die easily, especially when it has been worn like armor. They muttered about luck, about chance, about a fluke of wind, but winter does not respect excuses. By midday, the first copy appeared. A man began digging inside his own cabin, tearing up packed earth with numb hands. He worked without asking for permission or advice. He had no time for pride. Another followed, then another. The fire pit spread quietly, not as innovation, but as survival. Some asked for guidance. Some pretended they had thought of it themselves. The man offered no judgment. He helped where he could. He watched others fail, adjust, and try again. Earth was packed tighter. Stones were repositioned. Airflow was corrected through trial and error. This was how the knowledge had always been passed. By necessity, what had been mocked as primitive now revealed itself as something far more complex. It was not about fire alone. It was about understanding how heat moved, how the land could hold it, how the body lived close to the ground where warmth lingered longest. The settlers had not been ignorant. They had been arrogant. They believed survival came from imposing their will on the land, cutting deeper, burning hotter, building bigger. They had mistaken force for intelligence. Native knowledge had taken a different path. It accepted the land as it was. It observed. It adapted. It conserved. Some settlers could not bring themselves to admit this out loud. They did not speak the words. They did not offer apologies to the people whose methods they had dismissed. But their actions told the truth. They dug. By nightfall, the settlement felt different. Fires burned lower. Smoke thinned. Woodpiles shrank more slowly. The ground itself seemed to breathe warmth back into cabins that had been cold for weeks. Not everyone was saved. Frostbite left its mark. Illness followed exhaustion. Some families would carry the cost of that night for the rest of their lives, but the worst had been averted. Laughter never returned. In its place was a quieter sound, the scrape of stone against earth, the steady work of people who had learned too late but not too late enough. The fire pit did not change who they were. It changed how they survived, and in the silence that followed, one truth settled as firmly as the heat beneath their feet. The land had never been the enemy. Ignoring those who understood it had been. Spring eventually came, but it did not arrive gently. Snow lingered in the shadows long after the thaw began, packed hard and gray, refusing to let go. The river broke its ice with a sound like splitting stone. Cabins stood scarred from smoke and cold, their walls darkened, their doors warped. The settlement survived, but only just. In the months that followed, people spoke less about that winter. Memory, like frostbite, was something many preferred not to touch. They repaired what they could. They planted again. Life pushed forward as it always does, and slowly the fire pits disappeared. Iron stoves arrived first. Heavy, impressive things hauled over impossible distances at great cost. They promised control, convenience, power. Coal followed, then railroads, then furnaces hidden behind walls, heat delivered without effort or understanding. The low fire pits, so effective, so quietly brilliant, were filled in, boarded over, forgotten. Not because they failed, because they were no longer necessary. This is how knowledge dies. Indigenous survival techniques across the continent followed the same path. Earth-sheltered homes, thermal mass walls, snow-insulated structures. Food storage that worked with cold instead of fighting it. Each was adopted briefly, often reluctantly, then discarded as soon as industry offered louder solutions. History labeled them primitive. It was easier that way. The man at the center of this story did not leave behind blueprints or journals. His name did not survive in records. He didn't patent an idea or claim credit. He simply lived through a winter that should have killed him and many others. He did not invent the fire pit. He listened. That is the part history rarely celebrates. Listening does not look heroic. It does not announce itself. It does not build monuments. But on the frontier, it meant the difference between life and death. Today, the knowledge is returning, not through necessity, but through rediscovery. Modern survivalists, bushcrafters, and off-grid builders are relearning what indigenous communities always knew. That heat moves, that earth holds warmth, that efficiency matters more than spectacle. That fire, when respected, gives more than it takes. They dig low hearths again, they build with stone and soil. They study airflow not to maximize flame, but to preserve heat. They do it not because it is fashionable, but because it works. The same principles that saved one quiet settler during a brutal winter now power homes without electricity, shelters without fuel lines, and lives lived closer to the land. The wilderness has not changed. It is still cold, still unforgiving, still indifferent to pride. What changes is whether we choose to learn. That winter on the frontier revealed something uncomfortable, something settlers had not wanted to see. That progress does not always mean improvement. That wisdom does not always come from the loudest voice or the tallest structure. That the people who survived longest in a place often knew it best. History laughed at that fire pit. Until the firewood ran out, until the chimneys failed, until the cold came for everyone equally. The fire pit was never about warmth alone. It was about humility, about observing instead of assuming. About recognizing that survival knowledge is earned, not invented. Nature does not care what you believe. It does not care what you call advanced or backward. It does not care whose name is written in books. It only asks one question over and over again. Did you learn fast enough? That answer echoes in every forgotten technique buried beneath modern convenience, in every stone pulled from the ground and discarded, in every lesson ignored because it did not arrive wrapped in iron. The settlers survived that winter because one man chose to listen when others laughed. History nearly forgot why. But the land remembers, it always does.